We stop pests at the doorstep with nothing more than a coarse line of Epsom salt. And it works because those tiny crystals cut through the soft, damp bodies of slugs and ants the moment they try to cross. That is the whole secret, and by the end of this, you will know exactly how to use it. My name is Arthur Whitfield, and I was raised in a stone farmhouse in the Yorkshire Dales, where my grandfather kept a jar of coarse salt by the back door for as long as I can remember. He was not a chemist, and he did not read gardening magazines. He simply did what his own father had shown him. Because in those days, you could not run to a shop every time a slug got into the vegetable patch. I watched him crouch down on cold mornings and trace a line of salt along the threshold. Stones, and I watched, year after year, as the ants that used to march straight through our kitchen simply stopped coming. These were not theories to him. They were Tuesday mornings. They were how a household stayed fed and dry and free of nuisance, without spending a single penny on anything from a shop. I am sharing this now because so few people still know it, and because the ones who do know it rarely explain why it actually works. Somewhere along the way, the simple jar of salt by the back door was replaced by aerosol cans and plastic bait stations, and call-out fees for men in white vans. Pest control became an industry, and industries do better when a problem returns every season rather than being solved once with something already sitting in your cupboard. I am not asking you to be angry about that. I am only asking you to notice it, because once you notice it, the rest of this makes a great deal more sense. What you are about to hear is not a theory dreamed up on the internet last week. This is a method that was tested across hundreds of winters and hundreds of summers, by people who had no exterminator to call and no money to call one even if they had. It worked then, in stone cottages with dirt floors and drafty doors, and it still works now, on modern doorsteps in modern houses. Because the biology of a slug has not changed in 200 years, let us begin with why the barrier works at all. Because understanding this is what makes the method reliable, instead of a guess. Ants and slugs are what my grandfather called soft walkers, meaning their bodies rely on a thin, moist outer layer to move and to breathe. Coarse Epsom salt, which is magnesium sulfate in its crystal form, is rough and jagged under a magnifying glass. Nothing like the smooth grains of table salt you would use in a shaker. When a slug or an ant crosses that rough crystal surface, the sharp edges catch and score the moisture-sealed layer on its underside. And the magnesium sulfate begins drawing water straight out of the tissue through basic osmosis. For a slug, which is essentially a small sack of water with almost no protective shell, this is enough to make it turn back within seconds. For ants, the effect is slightly different because the crystal dust interferes with the fine sensory hairs on their legs and antennae, the very structures they use to follow scent trails back to a food source. Confuse those signals, and the column of ants simply loses the trail and stops advancing. Long before you would see a single one crossing your kitchen floor, that is the science behind it in plain terms. And now let us talk about how to actually lay the barrier so it works properly. Because most people who try this and fail are simply using the wrong salt or laying it the wrong way. You want coarse-grade Epsom salt, not the fine dissolving kind sold for bath soaks, because the fine crystals lose their sharp edges too quickly and dissolve into the stone before they have done any good. Look for the granular type, the kind that feels almost like rock salt in your hand with visible angular crystals rather than a soft powder. Lay the barrier in a continuous line, roughly 2 to 3 centimeters wide, directly across the threshold and along both sides where the door frame meets the ground. Because pests will simply walk around a gap if you leave one. My grandfather always said a barrier with a hole in it is not a barrier at all. It is decoration. And he was right about that. Do not scatter it thinly and hope for the best. You want a visible, unbroken ridge of crystals that an insect physically cannot cross without touching them. But that is only the first part of the method, because where and when you lay this barrier matters just as much as how thick you make it. The second part concerns timing, and this is where most people go wrong without ever realizing it. Epsom salt is highly soluble, which means a heavy rain will wash your careful line away within the hour, leaving you with a doorstep that looks protected but is not. Lay your barrier on a dry morning, ideally after the dew has burned off the stone but before. The day has warmed enough to draw pests toward the cool, shaded threshold, which in most English summers means somewhere between 9 and 11 in the morning. Check it again after any heavy rainfall, and get into the habit of a light reapplication once a week during the warmer months. Because a barrier that has thinned out from footsteps and weather is far less effective than a fresh one. In the depths of winter, when slugs and ants are largely dormant, you can ease off to a monthly check, simply keeping an eye on the line so it never disappears entirely. Keep watching, because the next part is where most people are genuinely surprised, and it changes how you think about using this salt at all. The salt you lay down is never wasted, even once it has done its work and dissolved into the ground. Magnesium sulfate is one of the oldest known garden tonics in English horticulture, prized by Victorian gardeners for encouraging strong dark green growth in roses and other flowering plants that struggled in poor soil. The magnesium helps a plant produce chlorophyll more efficiently, and the sulfate assists the roots in taking up nutrients that would otherwise sit unused in the earth. This means the very same barrier that dehydrates a slug on contact becomes once dissolved by the next rainfall. A gentle feed for whatever is growing near your doorstep, whether that is a rosebush, a pot of lavender, or the climbing plants. Many households train up around a front door. You are not choosing between pest control and healthy plants. You are getting both from the same handful of crystals, and that dual purpose is exactly why this method survived so long in households that could not afford to waste anything. Nothing in a countryside kitchen was ever used for just one job, and this is a perfect example of that old way of thinking. Let us move to the fourth part of the method, which is knowing exactly which areas of your home benefit most from this barrier, because the front door is only the beginning. Cellar doors and outbuilding thresholds were, in my grandfather's time, treated just as carefully as the main door, because a damp cellar is exactly the kind of dark, cool environment that slugs are drawn toward. Ground-level windowsills, particularly on the shaded side of a house where moisture lingers longest, are another place where a thin line of coarse salt will quietly do its work without anyone noticing it is even there. Garden shed doors, greenhouse entrances, and the base of outdoor bins are also worth treating, especially in late summer when ant colonies are actively scouting for new food sources. Think of your home as having a perimeter, not a single front line, and treat each vulnerable point the same way you treated the front step. This was simply how a countryside household approached the outside of a home. Every gap and every threshold accounted for, because a single overlooked entry point could undo the work done everywhere else. Now for the fifth part, which concerns something my grandfather was particular about, and that is where you place the salt in relation to your paving stones. If your doorstep is natural stone, such as sandstone or limestone, apply the salt directly onto the joints and gaps between stones rather than across the flat surface itself, because that is where moisture collects and where pests actually travel. On concrete or modern paving, the flat threshold line is fine, but always check for small cracks running toward the doorframe, since insects will use the smallest imperfection as a route around your barrier. For wooden door frames, particularly older cottage-style doors with a raised threshold board, lay the salt in the seam where the wood meets the stone or concrete beneath it, since that seam holds moisture and is often where soft-bodied pests attempt to squeeze through. Taking the time to understand your own doorstep, rather than applying the salt the same way everywhere, is what separates a barrier that quietly works for years from one that needs constant troubleshooting. This next part is where the method becomes something closer to a full household system rather than a single trick. So pay close attention here. Traditional countryside households rarely relied on just one deterrent, and Epsom salt was often layered alongside other materials that were sitting in the larder or the shed already. Crushed eggshells, saved through the week and dried on a windowsill, were sometimes mixed in alongside the salt because their sharp edges add an extra layer of physical deterrent that particularly bothers slugs, which dislike crawling over any rough, jagged surface. Wood ash from the fireplace, kept dry and stored in a tin, was another common addition. Spread just beyond the salt line on wet ground, where the salt itself might wash away too quickly. Since ash absorbs moisture and creates its own drying effect on soft-bodied pests, none of these were used in isolation. They were combined according to what the season and the weather demanded. And that flexibility is something worth remembering rather than treating this as a single, rigid recipe. Keep this in mind, because what comes next is one of the most overlooked parts of the entire method, and it concerns something most people never think to check. The seventh part is about your indoor entry points, not just the outside threshold, because a barrier that stops at the door itself is only half finished. If you have a porch or an enclosed entryway, treat the inner threshold as well as the outer one, laying a lighter line just inside the door where any pest that did make it past the first barrier would have to cross a second time. This double-line approach was especially common in farmhouses with a scullery or a boot room just off the main entrance, spaces that saw constant foot traffic and were therefore more vulnerable to whatever came in on shoes or boots. A light dusting along the inside skirting board, refreshed monthly, catches anything that slips through and reduces the chance of pests establishing themselves inside the home at all. This is not about being fearful of every gap in your house. It is simply the same layered thinking that kept a stone cottage dry and pest-free for generations without a single chemical spray. Now the eighth part, and this one concerns the wider garden beyond the doorstep, because the same principle scales up beautifully. If slugs are a persistent problem around vegetable beds, a wider ring of coarse Epsom salt around the base of vulnerable plants, kept several centimeters from the stem itself so as not to draw moisture from the plant's own roots, creates the same dehydrating barrier on a larger scale. This was particularly valued during the difficult years of rationing in England, when a single row of cabbages or lettuces lost to slugs could mean genuinely going without, and gardeners could not afford to lose a single plant to something they could prevent with a household staple. Kitchen gardens during those years were defended with whatever was available, and Epsom salt, already common in most homes for its use, easing tired muscles after long days of manual work, doubled icily as a garden protector. That wartime necessity is where a great deal of this knowledge was sharpened and passed down, tested under conditions where failure was not an inconvenience but a real loss of food. The ninth and final part concerns quantity and cost. Because one of the reasons this method faded from common use is that people assume anything effective must be complicated or expensive, when in fact the opposite is true here. A single 1 kilogram bag of coarse Epsom salt, which costs only a few pounds and lasts for months of regular use around an average home, will treat a front doorstep, a back door, several windowsills, and a modest garden bed with plenty to spare. Compare that to a monthly pest control contract, or a shelf of aerosol sprays replaced every few weeks, and the difference in cost becomes obvious almost immediately. There is no subscription, no call-out fee, and no chemical residue left on a surface where children or pets might walk barefoot, which is precisely why households leaned on it for as long as they did before other options were marketed as easier. Simplicity was never the problem. It was simply less profitable for anyone to remind you of it. I think about this often, sitting by my own back door in the evenings, watching the light fade over the fields the way it has done my whole life. What strikes me is not that we lost this knowledge because it stopped working, it is that we lost it because nobody had a reason to remind us of it anymore. A jar of salt does not need advertising. It does not need a subscription renewal, and it does not employ anyone to keep selling it to you month after month. My grandfather never thought of himself as clever for knowing this. He simply thought of it as ordinary sense. The kind of thing every household kept close at hand because it always had. I find a quiet satisfaction in knowing that the same jar sitting on a modern kitchen shelf can still do exactly what it did for him, on exactly the same kind of doorstep, using exactly the same handful of crystals. Nothing about a slug or an ant has changed, and nothing about a coarse crystal of magnesium sulfate has changed either. Which means this small piece of forgotten sense is simply waiting for anyone willing to use it again. If this has been useful to you, there are more methods where this one came from. I share a new one every day, drawn from the same kitchen table wisdom my grandfather passed down to me. The old ways are still here, quietly waiting. You simply have to know where to look.